Thanks first of all for inviting me, for the nice introduction, for those who are here also to be in this impressive building, looking also forward to the refreshments, and also for those online, thanks a lot for putting effort, and also curious to hear about your feedback, your questions. And thanks for the also students who were here this morning. I'm happy you could make it today as well. It's the first time I present so much of this research, because before I've been cutting it more in chunks, and also by putting it together, I hope it also stimulates a little bit more some debates on where to move forward, what could have been done better. Let me know if something's not clear, and I'll start. So by preparing this presentation, I first of all wanted to search. Sometimes you just want to pin your presentation and search some pictures. And when looking environmental migrants, initially you have this type of, well, maybe you don't see it so well, you have this type of images. But when you Google the same for environmental migrants in Morocco, you see actually quite a lot of pictures of sub-Saharan African migrants in Morocco already suggested by Google. So that is not the focus of my research, although I must say that in Tangier in Morocco there were, or I noted also a lot of migrant groups, and they were coming there more often than before. So it's a new field of study, which I did not study, just to highlight a bit what I did. So I will briefly sketch the research setting and method, discuss some more findings, and then hopefully reflect slightly more together with you on some challenges and things that could be done better. And this morning I gave a small talk already to some of you on the research setting of everything, what could go wrong, or what could be done better, or I included a broad discussion on researcher positionality. I'll leave that a little bit on the side, but I'll be happy to answer some questions on that as well. So today I will present actually my own field work, which was actually part of the Migrada project. It's a Belgium-based project. Actually, I'll stand a bit like this, otherwise you always, I'm sorry. Otherwise you never see the slides. I think this is better, yeah. So it was a Belgium-based project, funded also by one of the few federal funding organizations, together with the University of Liège, which I think you know even better than I do, who focused on migrants living in Belgium, coming from Morocco, Senegal, and Congo. I did the field work with people living in Morocco, with and without transnational networks. Samuel Lietard focused on Senegal, and Caroline Michelier focused on DRC. And I focus on particular regions in Morocco, and later my colleague Lubna Oussala focused on other regions in Morocco. Just want to highlight her work. She built actually further on my work and tried to do it better and learn from my own mistakes during the field work. So please also look at her work, but I won't present it as it would be too much for today. So these were actually the regions where we focused on in the Migrada project. So I focused on Tangier and Tinghir, and others focused in Senegal and Congo. And then Belgium, it's so small, we didn't put it on the map, but we focused on Brussels, Antwerp, and Liège. And the idea was to have a look at how migration could work as a climate adaptation strategy, which I think many of you are already very familiar with, and to look at it from a transnational perspective to see how migrants living in Belgium, often coming from regions, Morocco, Senegal, and Congo. Those are three regions where there's relatively a lot of people coming from, apart from people from Turkey, and where there's also, where the regions of origin are also heavily impacted by climate change. I focus on Tangier and Tinghir as they also are relevant in terms of mobility studies. So Tinghir is actually a gate to the desert, so a lot of people go there coming from the nearby regions, and it's also seen as one of the last places before you go into the desert, a big city. It's a provincial city. And nearby, you also have like one of the biggest solar panels in the world, fields. It's an oasis valley, which always had attracted people from nearby regions because there was a lot of water, and the city is also built around this oasis. So you see a lot of small agricultural fields, and surrounding you see a lot of old houses constructed by mud, which you had to renew once in a while. So you had to invest in them. So you see here that there are a lot of these houses already demolished because people abandoned living there because of the diaspora. So a lot of people from this region migrated after the Second World War to France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and many other countries, and they were recruited. So it's also interesting to see that maybe those groups were not necessarily the ones who would migrate so far, but because they were recruited through agencies, governments, they actually had different opportunities to migrate. This resulted in a huge, a particular culture of migration. Many people have migrated, and many people come back to see their relatives. There's a lot of return migration from people that are retired, who also go there, and they're not connected to any employment anymore. So they don't have to do there anymore. They just drink their tea, discuss things, and bring also a lot of information back. What's also, they invest in housing there, which they built according to European standards, which also made that many people adjusted to it. And they left aside the traditional housing. Like here you see differences there. Some people would still live in those houses, but those are also the ones who were the poorest in that region, who couldn't afford other things. Interestingly, now I went to some conferences there where they tried to look at the traditional method. So you see it, I think, at least in Belgium and the Netherlands, how people use the same techniques to better isolate their houses, to better deal with cold and heat. And sometimes in very strong winters or very hot periods, people would go to those older houses, as they're actually better preventing or dealing with weather conditions. So you see a very particular culture of migration here. People still want to migrate. It's not possible to migrate to Europe anymore, unless through family reunification, but you see that there's also a limitation there because people don't want to marry anymore. There's a huge network also living in Europe, people coming from the same region. If you want to marry someone from the same background, they experience, or the people are more familiar with the difficulties of having a marriage with someone who's maybe not educated in Europe and so on. So international migration becomes more difficult, but local migration is still very important. So people go to bigger cities and attract actually people from smaller cities from nearby regions. So I selected this based on previous research that already focused on this culture of migration, where migration is still popular, let's say. Not for everyone, but it has still some attraction for employment opportunities. And I thought this would be a region where people would migrate from, but actually it's also a region where many people migrate to from nearby regions. That's why it's so relevant that it's located nearby the desert, because of increasing desertification in that region, but also because of the attraction from other regions. So I miscalculated it, let's say, or maybe from a Western perspective, thought it wouldn't be an arrival city. Then the other city, Tangier, it's a gateway to Europe. Recently, the king invested a lot of industry here, and actually you see it almost here, it's a huge wharf. The port gets a lot of money. It was a little bit left on the side, but now people are a lot more investing in it. So it becomes also more attractive. There are many people going here through as a transit area, as you saw in the pictures coming from sub-Saharan regions, but also because there's a boat, looking here, there's a boat to Spain, and there are more options that people try to find their ways to Europe. Although many people stay here as well and build up their lives here as well. It has a typical port arrogance. I know it's from Antwerp. People think they're very center of the world, and that was a stereotype or the idea they had also in Tangier. So people were very proud of living there, which I recognize in Antwerp. People are also very proud. It's a stereotype, but are those cultures that are shared and seen also as a reason to stay. So if I would walk on the street, people would say, "Oh, you come from Antwerp." People know it because they have relatives, but they prefer to stay there and say, like, "Oh, well, that's not for us. We're hardworking. We're not unemployed. We don't want to go there because I think life is a lot better here." And there were also a lot of return migrants, young people, young professionals who felt like, well, I have experienced a lot of racism in Europe. Actually, here I have far more better opportunities, I have better training skills compared, or they're trained in Europe, and they get nice positions in those new industries. So this is the setup. Actually, I should go faster, I realize. But so there are two sides of research, and I selected them based on previous research that focus on this culture of migration. There are also different sizes, and I conducted more interviews in Tinghir than in Tangier, although it was also relevant to look at those interviews. So to focus on the findings, what I found striking is that even during conversations, knowing, if you look at IPCC reports, looking at the governmental initiatives, for instance, and the long traditions hereof, there was Plan Maroc Vert, so the Green Morocco plan. There was already, for instance, some first trials that people start to engineer clouds to get more rain. There were water wars before the Second World War. There were a lot of fights and struggles. So there's a huge dam policy from the king. So it is on the agenda. It is often seen as a region where there's a lot of climate impacts. But if you talk to people, you see a huge variety in replies. How do they perceive it? Because it, of course, it matters in the impact it has on their decision making. So I wanted to first focus on those perceptions and also explanations to understand people's behavior and decision making. And you saw that the way people learned about climate change also impacted and differed a lot. Some people learned it at school, so they would immediately talk about polar bears and the huge global ways climate change matters in the world, but not always apply to their own conditions. And then you have especially elderly women were my personal humble opinion, the most interesting in this context, they experienced it themselves, and they had quite fine-grained narratives on it. So they could experience it differently, but you had to ask it very slowly, because the typical climate change discourses, at the time I did an interview that on the television you saw the regional climate conference from Africa that was led also by Morocco. But there was a lesser connection in how people related them together. And I will just give some examples using quotes. Of course, there are more quotes, but it's exemplary to show, first of all, the interregional differences. And as you could assume already, that it had a bigger impact on people living in Tinghir than in Tangier. However, knowing that Tangier has a lot of migrants, internal migrants coming from different regions in Morocco, it was quite surprising to me that there was such a disconnection. Also, maybe because of the focus on relatively the center of Tangier and not the region surrounding it, but still. So, for instance, Budur from Tangier said, a shortage of water, no, that's not really a problem. We often see that in African countries, not considering actually Morocco is also an African country. But I don't think it's a big problem here in Morocco, not really, maybe in some other places, but not really in Tangier. We have water everywhere. You make taps everywhere so everyone can drink. You also have a tap here, a cup, and everyone who's thirsty who can drink from it. Maybe some people in poorer areas, yes, but I don't think it's a huge problem here. So of course it's a city environment, but the way of talking about other regions was also not very detailed, let's say, how it could impact some other people's lives. This is different from, for instance, Shafiq in Tinghir. Yes, because of the water. There's no water. It's not like before, like 40 years ago, like 30 years ago, like 20 years ago. Even after 10 years, it has changed. This year, we didn't have any snow. Well, there was snow, but it was not like years before in the mountain range. We had snow in March, April, May, but only a little bit in June and July. But now in March, there was nothing. In the old days, you could see snow in January, February, March, April, May, June. Always snow in the mountain range, but the last 3 years, there was no snow anymore. The water has lowered. And it impacted their oasis valley because it was very much dependent on the river flowing through it. And normally I have a picture, I will show it later, how they controlled already for many years within this oasis valleys the water through local arrangements, which were also very hard to change and make to make the region use for modern agricultural skills, because of the arrangements that were not necessarily set on paper. So it were also those local settings that made it harder to change. But of course, within these regions, there was a lot of variety, and I focus actually slightly more on Tinghir. But for instance, Rashid says here, it means that there are factories now in Europe. We're not influenced because we are far, maybe far for cities like in Europe, such as in Asia, Africa, Mexico City, places where there are a lot of factories, or there's petrol that's emitting CO2, but at home now we're a little affected, not so much. Which was different from Noor, who said, like, over the last years, there has been a lot of changes. There used to be a lot of water in the oasis, old houses made of mud, no drought, and people were still into agriculture. In recent years, people have been paying too little attention to their fields. They plant crops that hardly need water. They're easy to maintain, like the alfalfa for the donkeys, which is a type of wheat that grows, and that is also can be easily maintained without too much water, but also without too much work. This way, they don't have to put too much effort in it. You only have to maintain the alfalfa once or twice a year. Recently, only people coming from other places work on the fields. People from Tinghir work in administration or migrate. So you would feel also the differences, especially socioeconomic differences, and also where people lived in Tinghir, that mattered a lot. And I assume this is also often the case elsewhere, that there are a lot of differences. However, the ones who were in Tinghir were the ones who migrated, also because of the lack of interest in agriculture in the region that was very thriving before, that was very appealing just because of this water. Also because there were changes in search for more modern waterways, they would build a dam in the nearby area. So the ones who always had water were now the ones who had to migrate, shifting also again some social class, between social groups within that region, really related to where they were located in the oasis. And you would also see that it started sometimes to become very parallel worlds with those who were really seeing the differences over the years in their lifetime. That's why actually many of the women who worked in those fields were the ones who noted it the most, compared to young men who would migrate to larger industries. So they would go to Casablanca and say, like, I want to work there. They would go even to nearby regions in the Middle East, and they had to come back, or 3 months in Spain to work in agricultural fields. So they didn't connect any of their search for better opportunities to the environmental change, while changes in their oasis. While all the women were not the ones who would migrate, they were not able, they lost actually their relative income in the household, so they could contribute slightly less because of these changes. So they used to have a more powerful position within their household, but since their jobs they used to do were diminishing, it became a lot harder. And when I discussed with my colleague Lubna, who did research in another area where there was a lot more agriculture, but huge firms, she said it was quite the opposite. So women were advantaged over men, and especially those who weren't part of families. So they could be underpaid, working more vulnerable situations. And it also disturbed household relationships, just because of this, the fact that women were preferred to work and men were unemployed at home. And they had to search for other opportunities. So also there you see that it changes how people used to live together. And in both cases, it created more vulnerabilities for many women. But in this interview, and maybe I think one of you asked it in the morning actually, on how, or your colleagues, on how would you cite doing an interview with an interpreter. So this is a male interpreter who often also had some additional comments to the interview. But Chema was an older woman, relatively older, and she's and we did an interview also with the son present and with the interpreter. So the son said at the time there was less water, but nowadays there is sufficient water to use for almost everything. So back in the days there was less water, and there's there's more water. How come? She thinks there was such a change in water, and the interpreter replies, said, Dieu, it's God. God has given us the rain, the snow, it's God. So he translated it. And why do you think there's less rain? She said it's because of God. People don't have behaved properly in God. People are the problem. And I later interviewed some nomads who lost their cattle due to sudden rainfall, who also pointed actually at people like me, not wearing headscarves. They were really very vulnerable for that one. It was almost 2-3 days of snow they lived in the desert areas, but they weren't prepared for it. And their solution or their explanation was that it's because of the behavior of people. And what do people do? They really believe in God, and people always behave badly because God doesn't like that. They always violate the rules, they do wrong, they lie. women don't dress according to the rules, they dance, and they don't wear heels, which was the case. I wasn't there in my bikini, but I wasn't veiled either. So it was also something to consider in the future. In the next series of findings, so this already sketched a little bit diverging realities of people living in the same region, especially in Tinghir, and maybe if I would go a little bit more to the countryside, there was again a lot of other realities. And I think in Morocco, it's such a diverse country in many ways, also culturally. So in Tangier, there were more Arabs, but in Tinghir, it was more Amazigh. And also those power relations were felt. I won't go deeper into that, but I think you would feel it also in the interviews, in the ones who had to rely most on agriculture, which was more subsistence agriculture in that area, but knowing that there are a lot more other regions in Morocco, so it cannot be extrapolated to the other regions. So as I mentioned, I selected based on these cultures of migration, which also was actually impacting how people responded to their living situations, especially in Tinghir. There were people who had a lot of remittances they received, but it was often through associations, like one-person associations, who actually financed themselves to do things such as building a house for people with disabilities, to working, to adding a water pipe in a school, or to planting more trees in a school area. So to look at how the diaspora was there at work, you saw that people helped their relatives, and to rely less on agriculture. So you would see in Tinghir also a huge set of bars where many men who had their migrant networks, not all of them of course, but many people were also spending time there thinking of other solutions, while there were other people who came to work on their fields, also mainly to feed their animals. So it impacted their aspiration and gave also in that region a very weird vibe, because many people wanted to go to larger cities, but they also wanted to invest in training, but at the same time they received sufficient to survive without too much additional effort. So there were like a lot of different ways in which diaspora also helped. And more interestingly, like those remittances were often financial remittances were sent also during religious festivities. So then if you would ask, what do you do with it? Some people would buy or ask people to get money to buy pumps. They used to have diesel pumps, but now they're solar panels, solar-based pumps. But those pumps, of course, if you have a pump, then your neighbor has less. So it was often not integrated. So because of this decentralization, you saw that those smaller initiatives were not coordinated, and sometimes increased inequalities within the region. Although they were helping someone, they did not necessarily have an overview. Or it helped people to invest in training. So you saw a lot of training, but they were all in administration, things that are not necessarily used there, but would help you to migrate. So they were highly populated. And you would also see there a lot of gender differences. So many men would go to work, and our women would actually have to wait also to start a family, just because you cannot start a family if there are not enough resources. So you felt that there were some people a little bit waiting for times to become better. Was illustrated here, the quote, people have stopped working in agriculture, which also means that even if they would ask for resources, it would often not be invested in this agriculture, leaving it even more. So due to the land heritage system, you cannot sell your property. It means that someone leaves, has a property that can be divided by their relatives, for instance, or if if someone passes away, it's divided, or a part goes to the mosque. But it leads to a huge network of all small fields, and no one actually wants to invest in it, because you cannot go even and use a tractor in these very small fields, and it's not sufficient to meet up the living standards which people are very much aware of from the bigger cities, but also from Europe. So Sahib says, like, people don't wish to stay here working agriculture, they rather go to France and Europe, and they feel these differences in standard of living so much. So there are no means to work, there are no factories, no places to work, so everyone has a mentality to go and migrate, and that's why they have left it. So they have left agriculture, and I think this could be different in other regions for sure. But those without migrant networks, they still had to work in the same situation, but they feel they cannot leave. Even if they undertake some migration trajectories, it's often in a very vulnerable position that they have to give away their identity card or passport before, so they cannot really leave some places, or they work in a place where they cannot bring the money back. So you would see that they become more vulnerable. And again, here it's an interview with an older lady, and I asked, would she like to move to Europe? No, this family, no. Nobody, everyone works here, they work on the ground here, they work on the fields, they work in construction. They all have their reasons, they cannot leave Tinghir, they have to stay here in Tinghir. And would she like to move alone or together with her family to Europe? I don't think it's possible, I'll tell her, and they laugh very hard with my actually stupid question, because of the lack of abilities to migrate. It's also not even possible to think of it, especially when you're older. But so they laughed so hard. She said that she would like to migrate to Europe on the condition that you take care of her children and that you have to watch your kids. They're joking now, but not really, in the sense that due to the networks and obligations, but also not the means to migrate, not to networks, it's almost impossible to think of or imagine or to aspire to migrate. But for the next generation, of course, so these intergenerational aspirations are very, so for her kids, that's the only thing that we can later also clear. She wanted to have to migrate them because she knows, like, oh, it's, for me, it's not possible, but for her kids, yes. And she tried it in various ways. The one ended up in a better position than another. So also here, you see that they really had to rely on degraded land that was also not invested by policymakers, because why would you invest in a slowly decreasing deserts, and which is very hard to reach. So when you had to go there, you had to go through a long path. So if you would install something there, you always would have to bring it back to other places. So it was not economically so interesting. And then you see that this life course impacts how people think of migration and how you can develop these aspirations, because it was a very slow impact, but once in a while they had like sudden slow snow or floodings, which made them also reconsider their location, but especially the employment conditions were bad. So it wasn't an urgent displacement. But they realized, like, oh, there's no rain, there's no water, there's no life. I'll go slightly faster. And people are so used to the dry area because they have lived through it before, but that's also a reason that they thought of themselves, like, this is how we always lived. This is not something new to climate change. This is our way of being. You had very nearby a lot of people going to the desert, and they really understood their own migration in terms of economic factors, which I think you often also see in a lot of literature, that it impacts economic drivers of migration, but because of this group, it's so slow that they wouldn't connect it themselves necessarily. Only the ones, and you saw a lot of social divides. Some people were able to stay, and those were actually the more wealthier groups who wanted to stay. That you saw a lot in Tangier, but also in Tinghir. A geographer had a very good position, the doctor had a very good position, and they were very proud of their activities, and they wanted to maintain it, but they were also not connected to agriculture in this region. I think, I'm sorry, of the mismanagement of time, but I said many things. I just want to show a little bit more a particular case. And here again, you see a lot of the houses that were left, where it used to be a surrounding village here in the Oasis Valley. These places were abandoned. And here you see a lot of people. So this is the poorer areas, and here is the source with the dam. And here were all small rivers and the oases. So it's here where the mountains where some nomads lived, but also you saw them once in a while when their cattle was destroyed. It was very hard to get actually new and back in that lifestyle. And also here, people who had to rely more on wells were also dependent on the others. Here you see already one of the canals, and this is not even with concrete. So this is the alpha, but some were also just here. You had some big streets. But those were also not very much for to sell, and especially because there was a disease there in the day, so they couldn't do anything with it. But this is one of the canals, and so they had a system that it was a very long time. You had chiefs actually who checked the water. And let's say you have a small field, one of those fields, and then on Monday afternoon you could use the water from there. If you didn't use it, you're lost. But you could open the canal. But some of the canals were better maintained than others, like here. So you would lose already the very valuable water. But still, you could invest in that, or you could really have a no irrigation system. Here is the dam that they're going to build. Here you see already the certification, signs of this certification. And this is what I wanted to talk to you about. It's a project where you do see that some ideas or some match was between policymakers and the migrant networks they had. But it had to be like almost a unique combination of factors to make it work, because many people had migrant networks, but often it didn't result in any adaptation strategy at all. But here they tried to circumvent also the local land heritage system by building in the desert. So all the elderly were already upset. They said like, yeah, who does that? Who's going to invest in the desert? So that was the first thing. They used more funding from Catalonian government to invest in solar pumps. They had a basin, and they cultivated date trees that were more relevant, not relevant, but more interesting to sell. So the Majdoud dates are very high quality, and that you could sell and also keep for quite some time. So that would be, they would cultivate the trees and then sell the trees to people, and that would be and that's how the geographer actually said, like, that's how we attract young people to stay here. And they wanted to yeah, it was just building up. They wanted to make it big, so it becomes actually a reason to stay. Because there's so many young people leaving, only elderly stayed, also due to this migration cultures and other opportunities elsewhere, and just rural-urban migration flows, which you see often. So it also shows how, although there are many people having associations, there's a very top. There's a top, the king, and then you have very small-scale associations to deal with all kinds of social welfare. So they had to deal with already everything, and it was often not coordinated. So it showed a bit like the potential to work together, but at the same time, it's very vulnerable, especially in this region with no new support, no governmental structures that could support those kind of things. And then I'll leave some of the challenges. Of course, it's a small-scale case study in 2 regions, which could be more fine-grained in terms of maybe focusing only on particular professions or only people who had migrant networks, and maybe look at nearby areas in Tinghir, the people where people originate from that come to Tinghir, instead of going already to Tangier, to the bigger cities. But based on these interviews, it highlighted also the different perceptions and explanations people have on environmental changes, and whether they apply it to their immediate condition, living conditions, and how they understand it. So I think, I'm not sure, I maybe say too much this anecdote, but I heard once a lecturer talking about this international climate meeting, and he said, like, someone from Bolivia said, like, oh, what's with Pachamama and how we deal with Mother Earth. And in some climate debates, maybe it was old school, they laughed it away, but I do think that dealing with how people view their environment, the religious interpretations, for instance, of how things happen, are needed to consider in the future, and to look at how to deal with communities that are impacted by climate change, to look more at those individual interpretations before you're able to do something together, let's say, and maybe look at how they propose to do something together, which was not done in Morocco, at least not in this region. Maybe there are more other findings on that. Also, this focus on the cultures of migration is interesting, and I think also Samuel Lietard had it in Senegal, that you saw some villages totally being funded by the diaspora, and other nearby villages not, which creates a lot of inequalities. So it's very, if you do not coordinate any action there, and also a lot of pressure, of course, on migrants and their networks, to deal with it, it does not really create like a solid solutions, I think. Also the life course, it's very important. I think in a lot of mobility studies, you see already that people migrate at particular moments in time, especially when they can plan it. And when you're facing slow environmental changes, you can more easily plan it compared to other situations, but it would also mean that you have to consider that it's a selective group that migrates and create and develops its aspirations also based on the abilities they have. And here you saw a lot of social and ethnic inequalities that are being reproduced and strengthened actually by actions from migrant networks, by actions from policymakers, and also just in the way they built up their lives. Migration as an adaptation strategy, I think there's a lot more to say. I cannot say that so much with my data, but it was interesting to see how it also could lead to maladaptation in particular regions, and that you have to consider the pressure put on already vulnerable groups in society, and that some groups are left out. and that other groups are also having a lot of pressure. People do it to support each other, of course, and that I support. So there are some strategies to, let's say, reduce taxes on remittances. So in Morocco, there's a lot of income from the country from all those remittances, but of course, that is more to support each other instead of support climate actions. And I think that was more or less it. Thanks a lot for your attention and other questions. And maybe if there are more questions, I can always discuss my challenges, or you can comment.